The day Diana Voss decided she no longer needed Marcus Cole, she was standing in the middle of the server room with her arms crossed and her lawyer on speakerphone. Marcus was crouched in the corner with his hand inside a junction panel, running a diagnostic he had started 40 minutes earlier. He heard her heels on the raised flooring before she spoke. He did not look up. She told him to stop what he was doing and look at her. He looked at her. Diana Voss was 36 years old. She had built Voss Integrated Solutions from shared office space and a $200,000 seed round into a commercial building automation company with 41 employees and contracts across 7 cities. She wore navy almost exclusively. Her hair was always the same. She had a way of entering rooms that suggested she had already calculated the exit. She told him that effective immediately, his services were no longer required. That the company had retained a team of specialists, 10 of them, she specified, 10, from one of the most respected infrastructure firms in the country. Credentialed professionals with certifications and portfolios and contacts at companies whose names Marcus would recognize. She said all of this without raising her voice, the way people deliver news they consider a formality. Marcus withdrew his hand from the panel. He stood. He was not a tall man, but he had a stillness about him that occasionally made people uncertain of how to read him. The fault in Relay 7 hasn't been isolated yet, he said. Diana looked at him the way she looked at most things that inconvenienced her, briefly and without sentiment. The new team starts Monday, she said. Security will have your badge deactivated by end of day. He picked up his toolkit from the floor. He thanked her. She had already turned back to her phone. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus Cole had been working at Voss Integrated for 11 months. Not because it was the best job available to him, but because it was the right distance from Nina's school. 14 minutes by car, 9 if he caught the lights. And because the hours allowed him to be home by 6, which meant dinner together, which meant the particular ritual that had kept the two of them anchored since his wife died 3 years before. He was 38 years old. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a brick building on Garfield Street, in a neighborhood that was neither declining nor recovering, but had been sitting in approximately the same condition for 15 years. The apartment was clean and organized in a way that required daily effort, because space was limited and Nina had a habit of spreading her projects across every flat surface she could find. Nina was 7. She had her mother's eyes, a shade of brown that went amber in direct light, and her father's habit of going completely still when she was thinking hard about something. She collected hardware the way some children collect shells. Screws, bolts, hinges, small springs pulled from ballpoint pens. She kept them sorted in a row of mason jars on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, arranged by size, smallest on the left. She had started the collection the year her mother died. Not as a direct response to grief. She had been too young to process the grief in those terms, but because she had started spending more time watching her father work, and the pieces interested her. She called them his ingredients. He had stopped correcting her after the 3rd time. She was not wrong. The apartment smelled of coffee and machine oil. He had tried once to address this with a cleaning product a neighbor had recommended. The neighbor's apartment smelled fine. Marcus's still smelled like his work, which was, he had decided, not a problem that required solving. He got up every morning at 5:15. The hour between 5:15 and 6:30 was the only part of the day that was entirely his. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with whatever technical documentation he was working through at the time. For the past 4 months, that had been a dense manual on thermal compensation algorithms and closed-loop control systems, borrowed from the public library's technical collection and renewed twice. He made notes in a composition notebook in a handwriting that was small and very precise. Nina woke at 6:30 with the consistency of someone who had set an internal clock and never questioned it. She came to breakfast in whatever she had fallen asleep in, which varied in entertainment value. She sat on the stool across from him and poured cereal with a concentration that suggested she considered the cereal-to-milk ratio a matter of some importance. She had questions most mornings. Not small talk. Nina had no particular interest in small talk, but actual questions the kind she had been holding since she woke up or possibly since the previous evening. The morning after Diana Voss told him he was no longer needed, Nina asked him why. When he closed his eyes before touching a wire, he tilted his head slightly to the left. He told her he wasn't sure he did that. She told him he did. Every time. She had observed it. He thought about it. He told her it was probably because the left side of his head had always been slightly better at processing certain sounds, and that touching a connection sometimes produced a faint audible signal before the physical sensation, and that he had likely been compensating for that without knowing it for a long time. Nina absorbed this. She ate a spoonful of cereal. She said, "So you're listening to the wire." He told her that was one way to put it. She nodded in the way she had of settling into answers. Not relieved, just recalibrated, like a compass that had been slightly off and found north again. She finished her cereal, rinsed her bowl without being asked, a habit he had been trying to establish for 2 years and had apparently succeeded at without noticing, and went to get ready for school. Marcus sat at the table a moment longer. He had not told her yet about the job. He would tell her that evening, after dinner, when there was time to answer the follow-up questions properly. Nina's follow-up questions were often the real ones. What Marcus did not tell Nina, what he had not told anyone at Voss Integrated Solutions, was something he had decided 4 years ago was no longer relevant to how he moved through the world. Before Nina was born, before the years that had reshaped him into a man who woke at 5:15 and read library manuals and drove 14 minutes to a school because the timing was right, Marcus Cole had worked as a lead systems architect at a firm called Arctis Engineering. He had spent 9 years there. The last 3 of those years, he had led the team that designed and built the control architecture for what became one of the most widely replicated commercial building automation systems in the Mid-Atlantic region. The patents were still active. His name was on 4 of them. He had left Arctis 8 weeks after his wife died. Not because the work had stopped mattering. It had kept mattering, the way precise and difficult things continue to matter even when everything around them falls away. He left because Nina was 11 months old, and he had looked at the shape of his life, the travel, the deadlines, the consuming velocity of that kind of work, and understood that the shape needed to change. He made that decision without drama and without grieving it publicly. He told his director, returned his access credentials, packed the contents of his office into a single moving box, and drove home to his daughter. The field notes from the last project he had worked on at Arctis, a thermal load distribution analysis for the Meridian Tower retrofit, were still in a binder on the shelf above his desk at home, between a children's atlas and a book about bird migration that Nina had requested from the library and never fully finished. He had not looked at those notes in 3 years. He thought about them sometimes the way a person thinks about a version of themselves they have not visited in a while. He thought about them on the morning after Diana Voss let him go. He sat at the kitchen table while Nina asked about the tilt of his head and considered the particular quality of irony involved in being replaced by 10 specialists on a system that, in its essential architecture, bore a clear family resemblance to work he had done before any of those specialists had likely sat for their certification exams. He drank his coffee. He let Nina describe a dream she'd had about a city made of glass, where all the buildings could talk to each other through the wires in their walls. He told her that was not entirely unlike how some systems actually worked. She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes and said, "Then why don't buildings just fix themselves?" He told her that was the right question. She seemed satisfied by this. She went to get her backpack. He watched her go and thought about Relay 7, still unfixed in the panel on the 4th floor of Voss Integrated, and the fault he had been 40 minutes from isolating when Diana Voss told him to look at her. He thought about the 10 specialists she had hired to do what she had decided he could not. He did not feel angry. He felt the clear, flat certainty of a man who knows that time will eventually make a wrong thing plain, and who has learned, through the particular education that only loss provides, that certainty and urgency are not the same thing. He picked up Nina's backpack from the hook by the door, checked that her lunch was inside, and went to tell her they were leaving in 5 minutes. Outside the kitchen window, the morning light came through at a low angle and caught the row of mason jars on the sill. The screws and bolts inside held the light in small copper and silver points. The jars were sorted by size. smallest on the left. The 10 specialists from Meridian Technical Group arrived Monday morning in 2 transit vans, with a project manager named Garrett who wore a lanyard carrying 4 credential badges and a confidence that Diana Voss found immediately reassuring. She gave him the full tour herself. Server room, HVAC integration points, the master control panel on the 4th floor, the secondary junction array in the basement that no one had fully documented since the building's last retrofit. She walked them through each area with the precision she brought to board presentations, specific, sequential, nothing assumed. Garrett nodded at appropriate intervals and used the word absolutely with a frequency that she chose to interpret as professionalism. She went back to her office feeling that the situation was managed. This was what 10 specialists looked like. 2 vans, 4 credential badges. The word absolutely delivered with conviction. She had made the right call. She told herself this the way she had learned to tell herself necessary things, directly, without lingering on it, and then moving on to the next item on her calendar. Diana Voss had built her company on forward motion. She had learned early that stopping to examine a decision too closely was an indulgence she could not afford, because the people watching her, the investors, the board, the industry contacts who had smiled and doubted in equal measure when she launched, were always looking for a reason to confirm what they had already decided about her. That she was young, that she was lucky, that the company's growth would eventually reveal the limits of whoever was actually running it. She had been 31 when a board member, a man who had been in commercial real estate for longer than she had been alive, told her over lunch that he admired her ambition and that he hoped she had someone experienced she could lean on. He had said it with warmth. She had smiled and thanked him and spent the drive back to the office converting the anger into something she could use. That conversion, of being underestimated into forward motion, was what had built Voss Integrated. It was also, though she could not have articulated this, what had made her reach for 10 credentialed specialists rather than asking the man already inside the panel what he thought he had found. She had looked at Marcus Cole and seen worn work clothes and an unhurried manner and a face that gave very little away. She had made a calculation in approximately 3 seconds and proceeded accordingly. She was very good at fast calculations. She was not, in this instance, correct. By Wednesday, the building's HVAC had started cycling irregularly on the 3rd and 5th floors. Garrett described it in his email as a load-balancing anomaly they were working to trace. Diana read the email twice, approved a meeting for Friday, and said nothing to the board. By Friday afternoon, the primary load balancer on the 3rd floor had dropped twice in 6 hours. The second drop triggered a partial shutdown of the climate control system serving the company's main server room. 3 servers ran hot for 40 minutes before the backup cooling engaged. No data was lost. The margin, as Dana from IT explained it, had been closer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Garrett stood in Diana's office that Friday evening and described what his team had found, which was, in his own carefully managed phrasing, a foundational architecture discrepancy between the system's documented configuration and its actual installed logic. What this meant in practical terms, though Garrett did not say it this way, was that the system on paper and the system on the walls were not the same system. Someone had built it differently than the documentation said, and the documentation was what Garrett's team had been working from, and the gap between those 2 versions of reality was exactly where the fault lived. Diana asked him how long to resolve it. Garrett told her he was going to need to bring in a schematic specialist. She looked at him for a moment. "You have 10 people," she said. He had 10 people, he agreed. None of them had seen this specific configuration before. She sent him back to the 4th floor and sat at her desk and did not move for approximately 90 seconds, which was, for Diana Voss, a significant period of stillness. Over the weekend, 2 more members of Garrett's team called in separately with the same assessment. The installed architecture didn't match anything in the industry's current literature. Someone had designed it in a way that was not standard, and whoever that person was had not left sufficient documentation for anyone arriving cold to reverse engineer it in a reasonable timeline. The fault in Relay 7, the one Diana had watched Marcus Cole reach for 11 days ago, was the entry point to something far more complex than a failed component. It was not a repair problem. It was a comprehension problem. And Garrett's team, for all their credentials and their 2 transit vans, was working a language they had not been told the system was written in. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Nina had drawn a picture that Saturday afternoon of what she called how a building thinks. It was a sheet of printer paper covered in looping lines connecting small labeled boxes. Boxes she had labeled with words like air, power, cold room, and at the center of the diagram, a larger box she had labeled simply the brain. The lines ran between them in a pattern that was, Marcus noticed when she handed it to him across the kitchen table, not entirely unlike a basic network topology. He asked her how she had come up with it. She told him she had been thinking about what he said about buildings talking to each other through their wires, and she had tried to draw what that would look like from the inside. He studied the drawing for a long time. She ate the rest of her sandwich. He told her it was good. She said she knew that already, which was true, and not said with any particular arrogance, only the settled confidence of a child who has learned to trust her own observations. He folded the drawing and put it in his jacket pocket. He wore it there for the rest of the day without thinking about why. His phone rang on Sunday evening at 8:43. He did not recognize the number. He answered it. The man on the other end introduced himself as Chun. He was one of Garrett's engineers, he said, the one who had been assigned to the system's primary control layer. He had been going through the relay assembly on the 4th floor for the past 2 days. He had found a component stamp he did not recognize. He had run the number against the patent database. He asked Marcus if he was Marcus Cole, who had been a lead architect at ArcDis Engineering. Marcus said yes. There was a pause on the line. Chun said, "The installed architecture on this system. It's yours, isn't it?" Marcus told him it was a modified version of work he had done at ArcDis, that the building's original contractor had licensed the design and adapted it for the specific load profile of this installation, that the adaptation had been made without full documentation, which was not uncommon in contracted retrofits from that period. Chun asked him if he knew where Relay 7's fault was. Marcus said he had been 40 minutes from isolating it when he was let go. Another pause. Chun said he would make a call. Marcus said he appreciated it and ended the conversation and sat for a moment at the kitchen table in the apartment on Garfield Street, with the coffee going cold beside the composition notebook and the mason jars on the sill catching the last of the evening light. Nina was already asleep. He could hear the small, even sound of her breathing through the half-open door. He thought about Relay 7. He thought about the 40 minutes. He put his jacket on and drove to the building. Garrett met him in the lobby, and the look on Garrett's face was the look of a man who has been managing a situation for 11 days and has run out of ways to manage it. He shook Marcus's hand with both of his and said nothing unnecessary. Diana was already on the 4th floor when Marcus came through the stairwell door. She was standing beside 2 board members, a man named Holt and a woman named Rice, both of whom had been on a conference call about the system failure when Shin made his call to Garrett. She turned when the door opened. She looked at Marcus, at the worn jacket, at the toolkit he carried in his left hand. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did. A slight tightening, the compression of a person who is reconciling what they see with what they have been told. "I appreciate you coming," she said. The words came out in a register that was not quite warm and not quite cold. The register of someone buying time. "We had a separate technician previously," she said to Holt, as if offering context. "He's agreed to take a look." Marcus had heard himself described in more accurate terms, but he said nothing. He moved toward the panel. Garrett's full team was on the floor, all 10 of them, positioned at various points around the relay assembly with their equipment and their documentation and their 11 days of collective effort spread across a portable work table along the south wall. They watched him cross the room. A few of them recognized him from Chin's description. Most of them simply watched the way people watch something that is not yet resolved. Marcus set his toolkit down. He opened the panel. He looked at the relay assembly for a long moment without touching it. Then he moved to a secondary access point on the left side of the panel, one that, from the positioning of Garrett's team's equipment, had clearly not been opened, and removed a small cover plate with a flathead screwdriver. Behind, it was a junction cluster that the original contractor had installed behind the standard access pathway, a documented feature in his Arctis work that did not appear in the building's retrofit paperwork. He located the fault in 4 minutes. A thermal expansion fracture in the base connector of Relay 7, invisible from the standard access side, visible and unambiguous from the secondary point. He made 3 adjustments. He replaced one connector from his toolkit. He closed the cover plate. He stood up. The building's control panel on the east wall, which had been showing an irregular status light for 11 days, went steady green. The room was completely still. Garrett's voice came first, low and careful. "How did you find that access point?" Marcus looked at the panel. "I put it there," he said. Chun, standing near the work table, had already pulled up something on his phone. He walked it over to Holt without a word and held the screen so the board member could read it. Holt read it. He looked up at Marcus. He looked at Diana. "This is a patent filing," Holt said. He read the title aloud. Adaptive Load Distribution Architecture for Integrated Building Control Systems. Arctis Engineering. Filing date 11 years ago. He paused. "Lead inventor," he said, and read the name printed beneath it. Marcus Cole. Diana Voss stood in the middle of the 4th floor with the green light on the control panel behind her and the 10 specialists around her and the 2 board members and the silence that follows a room catching up to something it should have known earlier. Her face did not collapse. She was not a person whose face collapsed, but something in it shifted, a precise and visible shift, the kind that happens when the model a person has been working from turns out to be missing a critical variable. She looked at Marcus. He was closing his toolkit. He was not looking at her. He was not performing anything. He had come because a system he had designed was in trouble, and he had fixed it, and now he was closing his toolkit. He had the unhurried manner of a man who has done a thing and does not need anyone to confirm that the thing was done. Rice, the second board member, said something quietly to Holt that Marcus did not hear. Garrett's engineer, Chun, was still holding the phone. The patent filing was still on the screen. Lead inventor. His name, plain and specific and 11 years old and entirely unmistakable. Diana said nothing. The green light held steady. Outside the 4th floor windows, the city continued its evening without interruption, indifferent to the particular silence that was filling a room where a woman who had made a fast calculation 11 days ago was standing in its consequence and beginning, in the only way available to her, to understand what she had missed. No one spoke for a long moment after Holt read the name aloud. Then the room exhaled, not all at once, but in pieces. Garrett turned back to his work table and began organizing papers that did not need organizing. 2 of his engineers stepped away from the panel with the specific purposefulness of people who need somewhere to be. Chin put his phone in his pocket and looked at the floor. Marcus picked up his toolkit by the handle. Diana said, "Mr. Cole," and he looked at her once, briefly, without expression, and then walked to the stairwell door and went through it. She stood where she was. The green light on the control panel held steady behind her. Holt said something to Rice that she did not fully register. She was watching the stairwell door settle back into its frame. She had made a fast calculation 11 days ago, and it had been wrong. And the particular quality of being wrong in front of board members and 10 specialist witnesses and a patent filing on a phone screen was one she had not experienced before. She had been wrong in private. She had been wrong in small, correctable ways. She had not been wrong like this, structurally, visibly, in a way that was now part of the record. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and did not open her laptop for 11 minutes. The word moved through the company the way things move through small organizations, faster than any official communication, slower than the truth. By Tuesday morning, Diana's assistant had fielded 2 calls from staff asking adjacent questions that were really one question. Holt called her directly at 9. He was not unkind. He asked her how long Marcus Cole had been on staff, and when she told him 11 months, he was quiet for a moment and then said that was something she might want to think about. She told him she already was. Garrett submitted his final report on Wednesday. It was thorough and professionally written, and in its section on resolution methodology, it described the fault isolation as having been completed by the building's original systems architect, whose foundational design had not been accounted for in the initial assessment scope. He did not editorialize. He did not have to. Marcus told Nina on Monday evening over dinner. He told her he had gone back to the building, that he had found the problem, and that he was no longer working there. He said all of this in sequence, without loading it with anything extra. Nina ate 2 bites of her food. She said, "Did the lady know you built it?" He told her she did now. Nina thought about this. She said, "Is that good or bad?" He told her he wasn't sure yet. He told her it was true, which was its own category. She accepted this and asked if there was more rice. Diana Voss arrived at Marcus's building on Garfield Street on Tuesday morning at 7:52. She had gotten the address from HR the previous evening and spent 20 minutes in her car outside before getting out. She was not someone who spent 20 minutes deciding things. The fact that she had registered it. Marcus answered the door in the clothes he wore to work. Dark canvas trousers, a gray long-sleeved shirt. He looked at her without surprise. He stepped back from the door and let her in. Nina was at the kitchen table, finishing breakfast. She looked at Diana with those amber-brown eyes and the total, unmanaged attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Diana said good morning to her. Nina said good morning back and then looked at her father to see what this was. Marcus told Nina to go get her backpack, that they were leaving in 10 minutes. Nina slid off the stool, picked up her bowl, rinsed it without being asked, and disappeared down the hall. She glanced once at Diana on her way out of the kitchen, not with hostility, with the careful, cataloging attention of someone who wanted to remember this accurately. Diana stood in the kitchen. She looked at the mason jars on the windowsill, the screws and bolts sorted by size, smallest on the left, and then looked back at Marcus, who was leaning against the counter with his arms folded, not impatiently, just waiting. She had prepared something to say. It had sounded correct in a car. Standing in his kitchen, with the smell of coffee and the morning light on the jars in Nina's cereal bowl, still wet in the rack, it felt like the wrong instrument for the situation. She said, "I made a decision about you in about 3 seconds. I don't usually examine those decisions." He said nothing. "I looked at what you were wearing," she said, "and how you moved, and I decided I already knew what I needed to know." She stopped. "I've had that done to me. I know exactly what it feels like, and I did it anyway." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went past on the street below. He said, "Why did you come here?" She said she wasn't entirely sure, that she had started to write a formal letter and stopped because it felt like the wrong distance, that she had thought about calling and decided that was worse, that she had sat outside for 20 minutes trying to figure out what the right thing actually was and come up empty, so she had knocked on the door. He looked at her for a long time, not measuring her or punishing her with a look, something more neutral than either of those things. The way a person looks at something they're trying to understand accurately. He said, "The system's documentation is incomplete. Garrett's team is going to keep running into the same gaps." Diana said she knew that. He said he could put together a proper schematic record. The full installation logic, the secondary access points, the load compensation parameters that didn't make it into the retrofit paperwork. He said he would do it as a consulting engagement, 3 weeks, his rate, his hours. She said that wasn't why she came. He said he knew that. He said he was offering it anyway, because the building needed it and because he had designed the system and it bothered him to leave it undocumented. He said neither of those reasons had anything to do with her. Something in Diana's face shifted, not the controlled, managed shift of a professional absorbing difficult information, but something smaller and less guarded than that. She said, "Why are you being decent about this?" He said, "Because my daughter's going to come back out of that hallway in 4 minutes, and I don't want her to see me being anything else." Diana looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a short, involuntary sound, the kind that comes before the management catches up with it. And then she stopped and looked at the floor and said she understood. Nina came back from the hallway with her backpack on, assessed the room, and told her father she was ready. Marcus told her 2 more minutes. She sat down on the stool and looked at Diana again with those cataloging eyes. She said, "Do you work in a building?" Diana said yes. Nina said, "Does it have a brain?" Diana looked at Marcus, who gave nothing away. Diana told Nina that she thought it did, though she hadn't understood that until recently. Nina considered this with the seriousness she gave to most information. She said, "My dad can explain it to you." Then she looked at her father. Right? Marcus told her that was probably enough for now. Nina seemed satisfied. She rearranged a strap on her backpack and waited. 3 months later, Marcus Cole was contracted to Voss Integrated Solutions as a consulting systems architect. The engagement had started at 3 weeks and extended twice. Not because Diana asked him to extend it, but because the documentation work had opened into something larger, a full infrastructure audit of 3 properties the company managed, each with similar installation gaps, each requiring the same foundational comprehension that only he could bring to it efficiently. He set his own hours. He was home by 6. He drove 14 minutes to Nina's school in the morning, 9 if he caught the lights. Nina's winter medication had been covered in full since October. The manila folder on top of the refrigerator was still there. He had not thrown it away because the bill still arrived and the problem was still a long one, but the weight of it had changed. An open question had become an answered one, and the distance between those two things remained, as it always had, almost immeasurably far. Hull had made 2 introductions. Firms that had found the ArcDis patents through the filing that Chun had pulled up on his phone in front of a room full of people on a 4th floor in October. Marcus had taken one meeting. He had listened, asked 4 precise questions, and told them he would think about it. He was still thinking about it. Diana ran her company differently now, not dramatically, not in ways that were visible from the outside. She walked the floors more. She stopped in hallways and asked questions she did not already know the answers to. She had taken her assistant to lunch, which was something she had not done in 4 years of working together. Small changes, the kind that accumulate. She and Marcus had not named what was between them. Neither of them was built for naming things before understanding them, which meant they were, in that particular way, well matched. What existed was a specific quality of attention they gave each other, direct, unguarded, without the performance that both of them had learned to wear in professional spaces. It was not nothing. One evening in late January, Marcus was loading his toolkit into his car in the building's parking structure when Diana came down from a meeting that had run late. She stopped at her car, 1 row over. They were the last 2 vehicles on the level. The structure was very still. She said it had been a long day. He said most of them were. She said, "Thank you for the schematic work, the documentation." He said it needed doing. She said she knew that. She said she was thanking him anyway. She said that was different from the first time she had thanked him. He looked at her across the concrete and the low fluorescent light. He said, "I know." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she got in her car and drove out, and he closed his trunk and stood there for a short time in the parking structure's particular silence. He drove home. Nina had started a new collection. Not hardware. She had moved on from the mason jars without ceremony, the way children move on from one phase of attention to the next. She was drawing systems now. Network diagrams on graph paper, filled with labeled boxes connected by lines she drew with a ruler, precise and specific in the way her father had always been precise and specific. She taped them to her bedroom wall in rows. She had 14 of them. She had asked Marcus to check one for accuracy last week. He had stood in her doorway and looked at it and told her she had the load path wrong between the secondary and tertiary nodes. She had looked at where he pointed, nodded once, and corrected it with a red pen. She had not asked him to explain why she was wrong. She had trusted him, made the correction, and moved on. He had stood in the doorway for a moment after she went back to her drawing. He had thought about the answer she was going to find some morning years from now, when she looked up from her own work and understood what she had been moving toward all along. He thought about what it would feel like to watch that happen. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table at 5:15 the next morning with the composition notebook open in front of him. The binder from ArcDis was on the table beside it, not on the shelf between the children's atlas and the bird migration book. On the table, open, the field notes from the Meridian Tower retrofit spread across the left-hand pages and his current annotations filling the right. The mason jars were still on the windowsill, empty now, cleaned and sitting in their row. Nina had talked about using them for something else, though she hadn't decided what yet. Outside, the city was still dark. The light above the table was the only one on in the apartment. He turned a page in the binder and read and wrote in his small, precise hand, and the refrigerator hummed its low, familiar hum. And somewhere down the hall, Nina slept with her ruler on the nightstand and 14 systems on her wall, and the morning waited at the edge of the window to come in. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.